Good evening, everybody. Welcome again to Melbourne Jewish Book Week's second Tuesday of the month event. If you're in Melbourne, as many of you are, or Sydney, I guess this is an opportunity for an hour for us to forget just for a moment how are we going to get a haircut, or how do we speed home before curfew starts without getting caught. So sit back and relax. I'd just like to start by respectfully acknowledging the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which Melbourne Jewish Book Week is based, and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. I also acknowledge and respect the traditional owners of lands across Australia, their elders, ancestors, cultures, and heritage. My name is Nicholas Brash. I'm the Festival Director of Melbourne Jewish Book Week. And tonight we are privileged indeed to be having a conversation with someone whose novels, articles, and poems have delighted us for many years. She's entertained us with her thoughts and escapades and adventures from Carlton and Caulfield to New York, where she's lived for more than 30 years. And I'm talking, of course, about Lily Brett. And the sheer number of registrations we've had for this event is testament to Lily's popularity and just place in our hearts. Lily will be talking with Michaela Kalowski, an interviewer, moderator, presenter, program director of our sister organisation, if you like, the Sydney Jewish Writers Festival, and the curator of ABCRN's Big Weekend of Books. Tonight, they're going to be talking about Lily's latest collection of vignettes about aging. Old seems to be other people. What a great title. And no doubt a great deal more. We welcome questions being posted in the Q&A section, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. We will get to those questions in the last third, if you like. We'll get Michaela just to speak to Lily. But we will get to questions. But please, I know you know this, but please be aware, we always get more questions than we can ask. But look, Michaela, enough from me. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. It's an absolute pleasure to be here tonight in conversation with Lily Brett. It's an absolute treat to be part of Melbourne Jewish Book Week. But I know I speak for everyone here this evening that it's just an absolute joy to see you, Lily Brett, and to be transported into your home in New York and to be able to have this opportunity to speak with you and catch up with you. So thank you so much for being part of this festival.
Thank you. And I have to tell everybody it's 6 a.m. in New York.
That is commitment. Thank you. Obviously, I want to speak with you about the fabulous essays in your most recent collection, Old Seems to Be Other People. I agree with Nick. It's a fantastic title. But as I said, because it's such an opportunity to catch up with you after a period of time, I think it would be wonderful for us to kind of set the scene a bit first. And I know that people will have over the years will have read your extraordinary, powerful and sometimes sparse poetry, your poignant and short, often hilarious essays, or your 500-page masterworks like Too Many Men. And they will know that there are themes that you return to and characters that you return to again and again. And I wanted to ask, by sort of taking you back in time, and ask how growing up in the family you did shaped the sort of writer you became.
Well, it shaped the person I became. I think I grew up in a community that was in a state of grief. And this was in Carlton, and we really were all packed into a very small area, with one Jewish grocery store, Mr. Kurup's. And so we all knew each other very well. It was a very, very intimate community to grow up in. And I knew that they all had suffered. I don't know how I knew, but I did. I think you can intuit those things. And I loved them. And despite the fact that there was grief everywhere, the air was saturated with grief, which is no wonder, because no Jewish person who spent the Nazi era in Europe had a picnic. And they ranged from clearly posing as Aryans to hiding, to being in labour camps, to being in a ghetto, and ultimately to death camps. And so many of my parents' friends, and they were just a small inner circle of friends, were in death camps. And yet they all had a vibrancy about them. They all had a life about them. And when I think of what my mother alone went through, I'm not sure I'd have any life about me at all. So I loved them, and I loved listening to them talk. They always talked about what their husbands did last night or what their husbands didn't do last night. And there was just something fabulous about hearing the reality of what happened. And I think because I loved them, they loved me. So it really changed who I was. It gave me an understanding of suffering. And also my parents constantly said to me that it was very important to be a good person.
Mm-hmm.
And I spent many of my younger years, under 10, wondering whether I was good enough. Was I a good enough person? By 10, I definitely wasn't, because I was arrested for shoplifting.
Ah.
So I don't think that qualifies as a good person.
I need to know what you shoplifted.
Oh, just mostly junk, but pencils.
Pencils.
I always wanted more pencils. Pencils, pens, anything you could write with. And then because there was so much there, I just added a few bits and pieces. But my big mistake was, I'm usually a very good planner, but my big mistake was I went back again to get more.
Scene of the crime.
That's when I was arrested.
But in slight seriousness, I'm hearing, as you say, it shaped the person you became, but I'm also hearing all the ways it made you the kind of writer that you are, observing, translating what's being said, loving other people, being with other people, but also stealing pencils, preparing to write, really. I mean, and I wanted...
know that. I just love pencils.
Yeah.
And to get a pen was my dream. But you're right. I think I wouldn't wish that past on anybody ever, but I think that my parents' past and the community's past made me a better person than I might have been without it. My father came from a very, very wealthy family, and I might just have been a rich Jewish princess, instead of living in one room and then moving on to 2 rooms. And then when we had 2 rooms, we had relatives. My father's first cousin, Regina, came with her husband Isaac and their daughter Tosca. So again, I'm back into the bedroom with my parents, but there was something wonderful, and I loved them. Regina was fabulous, fabulous human being. And so is Isaac.
So much of the early poetry that you won so many awards for, which is incredibly beautiful and very striking and very sad making as well, really does grapple with the Holocaust. And there's the kind of like a triptych of those beautiful works of poetry. And you were one of the first Australian writers to give voice to what it was like to grow up in the aftermath of the Holocaust. You were sort of almost called the voice of the children of the Holocaust in Australia, of Holocaust survivors. And I wondered, you've spoken before, you said you could tell in the air there was something that had happened and you didn't know exactly what it was. But how did your parents or did your parents talk about what they'd experienced? What did you pick up? Because it's become such a thread in so many of your wonderful novels, particularly Too Many Men, but in all of your work.
I think what I picked up absolutely was that whatever happened, it was bad and it was worse than anything I would ever experience. And then my mother, she didn't set out to tell me things, but they flew out of her mouth. About children with holes in their cheeks And I spent ages wondering how you could get holes in your cheeks. And then decades later, I found the name of the disease that only people in death camps got. And she talked about things that were so disturbing. And in my early years, she used to sit at the table and cry, and I just used to sit next to her. So it wasn't like, it wasn't the same as growing up in a house where you had normal frictions. I mean, we had normal frictions and normal difficulties, but we had this huge, all-encompassing history. Because you can imagine, my mother had 4 brothers, 3 sisters, a mother, father, aunties, uncles, cousins, nephews, and nieces. I think if I lost one person in my family, I'm not sure how I could keep going. And so, let alone lose everyone you loved, to me seemed incomprehensible. And my mother told me stories about other people, what happened to this woman. And I always dreaded that this woman was her. And I later found out that in many of the things it was her. And they were truly unspeakable, in its correct use. And then I started to ask questions. And my parents' friends thought I was crazy. Like we had to get rid of this subject. We couldn't have someone asking us questions, especially someone young. And when I started writing about it, I started reading about it first, and then I knew that I knew what I was thinking was, in fact, most of what happened. And I was working as a journalist for Pole magazine and allowed to write very long articles, which was thrilling. And I was doing profiles of people. And David said to me one day, he said, "You write beautiful profiles, but you're so much more interesting than the people that you're interviewing." And I thought, this man is just besotted.
He's besotted and he's right.
But I had no idea what he was talking about. And he said to me, "Just give it a year, stop writing about anyone else or anything else and just see what you come up with." And I had no idea what I would come up with. I thought, but in fact what happened is I just started writing poetry, and David, who was in the poetry world for a long, long time, he's always been a man of culture as opposed to me. I was just backcombing my hair in the mirror.
and interviewing Jimi Hendrix, which we might talk about.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was interviewing all those people, but, another focus was how high I could get the beehive to go. But so he bought me a couple of books of Chinese poetry, and early Chinese poetry and probably contemporary Chinese poetry as well is extraordinary, because what the Chinese poets were writing about it applies to all of us. And then I just sat down and wrote. And I wrote the Auschwitz poems. And after I'd written about a third of them, I sent them off. And David said to me, "The thing you do about poems is you just send them to different publishers. You get an index card, which poem you sent to whom." And I got the hang of it pretty quickly, write a list, because this person says no, you send it to that person. And to my huge surprise, David said, "You're going to get them back. All of them are going to be back. But what you're doing is you're showing them that somebody else knew is writing poetry, but I didn't get any of them back. And then someone asked me if there were going to be a book. I was so naive. And I said, oh, yeah. I didn't know they were going to be a book, but if somebody thought they would be a book.
It's a book.
And that's really how I started writing, with no idea.
You spoke before about the things your mother, as you said, that just exploded out of her, that she didn't mean to say them, and the way that she told you things. And you use that word unspeakable, and there's been a huge amount of writing on whether we can write about those atrocities. There's from Primo Levi to Jean Amery to everyone about what transformations people undergo. And I wondered, just staying on craft, because you write so beautifully in so many different forms. You found words to write about things that were unspeakable, but I wondered, why poetry first? Because you write prose as well and essays about it. Why do you think poetry gave you the space to find the words?
Well, I think it was just the first thing that David suggested.
Oh.
I saw myself as a journalist, and it was reading a Chinese poetry that made me want to write poetry. And people said to me, you'll never make any money out of poetry. But I won the Victorian Premier's Award, and then very soon after I won the one of the biggest prizes in poetry, and they both came with cash. And I thought, what do they mean? You don't make any money with poetry. This is fabulous. I didn't realise that, it doesn't come along, very often to very many people, and I was just lucky. But then someone in America, a publisher in America, wanted to publish the Auschwitz poems, and then a friend got me an agent in America, and she said to me, you're never going to make any money out of poetry. Short stories, that's the way to go. Short stories are doing well. And so I wrote Things Could Be Worse. And when I look back at how I wrote it in a school notebook. Now, if you look at how I write, I have papers and papers and papers. And I wish I could write like that again. Just get a school notebook, you rub out a few lines. And I was so ignorant about how to write a book that I wrote a lot of stories, and when I handed them into Melbourne University Press, and I've just blipped her name, she was wonderful, the editor there, but I have to blip her name just when I'm on, being interviewed, because I would get it any other time.
Okay.
But she said to me, this is a book, isn't it? Because they published a couple of the stories. And I said, yes. And then she said to me, you don't have to have a different name for each character in each story. She said, there are characters who go from one story to the other. Because I didn't know. I thought, for the story, I've got to use new names. And so she went through it and linked. Jenny Lee was her name.
Okay.
And she showed me how you do that.
Mm.
That was my big education. I had two lessons in how to write. One of them was a journalist friend of mine. He was older than me, but he said, you've always got to start with a good line. You've got to get them in with a good line. He's talking about newspaper articles, and I thought, right, because no one had ever said to me how to write. So I thought, right, good opening line, you've got to get them in. And then I realised you can keep the same person in subsequent chapters.
But it's a wonderful point that Jenny made for you. But in Things Could Be Worse as well. You you brought to life characters, and I now hearing you speak that you sounds like you grew up with. And it's something that's been talked about a lot, that people, you've said, people confuse you for Lola Bensky. They confuse your father for Edek, and I wondered there if you make a delineation between the real life experiences that happen to you and the experiences you draw on that become fiction. Is there a line for you? Do you know when that's happening? Do you know, are you working something out, or how does it work for you?
Well, I have a policy of don't write anything out of revenge. Don't try and hurt anyone. And I think it's like a lot of writers. Even in non-fiction, something happens and it's not quite thrilling enough. So you just elaborate a little bit, add a few lines. And so basically I'm not aware of who's who. And my father really wasn't Edek. He just shared some qualities with Edek. And there were different qualities in different books. But, and there were qualities of my own. In Lola Bensky, there was clearly a struggle about a weight issue. And so I think I try to be as honest as I can and stay myself and not turn into another writer or another person, and I'm helped by the fact that I just love writing. I love putting words together. When I'm going to have a conversation with somebody, I actually play both parts. I think I'll say blah, 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 and then they'll say this, but I'll say that. And
you're writing dialogue. You're writing dialogue. Yeah. Inventing.
In my head all the time, And when I see words put together beautifully by other writers, I just admire them so much. I think it was Tim Elliott who wrote about Lola Bensky. She was waging war with her waistline.
Fantastic.
And I thought, what a beautiful line. I said to him, I wish I'd written that. She was waging trench warfare with her waistline.
The waistline. Fabulous. But also hearing you talk when you said that some of the ways that characters went from story to story wasn't obvious to you. You wrote the words yourself. You wrote all those chapters, all those stories, but it took someone else outside to link them for you. As readers, we read your work, and I read extraordinary relationships about mothers and daughters, these intertwined or with pockets of rage or pockets of, misunderstanding, or the desire for a mother's desire for a daughter to be something different, to achieve something different to what the daughter wants. It's brilliantly done in Lola, Lola Bensky. Even before the novel, you see that relationship she has with her mother. And it seems to me, hearing you speak, that it's not conscious. It doesn't, you're not sitting down going, I'm going to write about this moment with my mother that really got my goat.
No.
Yeah.
I never ever think like that. Some memory comes back to me and I'll write about it. It just comes into my head. But I never think I must. Sometimes I hear somebody in the street say something, and I used to drag out a notebook and write it down because it was usually something quite bizarre. But then I found that I actually could remember it. I mean, if I thought I wouldn't, I'd take out my notebook. I have a notebook and pens in every bag I carry. And David says to me, why are your bags so heavy? Because I say to him when we're out together, could you carry my bag?
It has a lot of pens. You never know.
No, but I think, I don't have any, I can't see in any pens. I better put some more in.
Yes, I know that feeling.
Yeah,
I'm not a writer.
No, but it's just, I think, have I got this in case I get a headache? Have I got this? My bag is sort of emergency. It's trying to cover all possible emergencies that could happen.
I think after your comment, I put this in my bag in case I get a headache. I think this is a good moment because to dive in a little bit into these wonderful new essays you've written. The old seems to be other people. They're incredibly relatable, and they're about all kinds of things. They're about aging and mortality and vulnerability, but they're also about toilets and showers and Trump and hedge fund managers who look like sensitive poets. They're about a whole lot of things. But I wondered, if you, when you were thinking about this collection, or now that it's out in the world, if you understand the relationship that you have with thinking about aging or a fear of aging and being a child of survivors. Is there something in that for you, do you think?
Well, I didn't think about aging much at all until I hit 70, and I thought, how could I have got here? I'm very, very, I couldn't understand what I'd done to fill in those 70 years. I thought, oh, well, I had children, I wrote books. What else did I do? 70 years is a long time.
You did a lot.
But I think that aging, I was very, very aware of all the people who died. My mother had her favourite niece who was 9 and was giving her, my parents were in hiding in the ghetto, and they still had work permits. 9-year-old still has a work permit, and she would bring my parents her soup every day for lunch and say she wasn't hungry. And I thought of all the people who died without living a life. And in a funny sense, my mother didn't die from not living a life. She died from only living part of a life. She was with her family a lot of the time I grew up. She was just with them. And, then my mother died at 64, and I'm terribly, terribly aware that I've outlived her by a large number of years. So death was very real in our family, and I often, when I was younger, used to feel the dead were more alive than the living. So getting old, I never felt old. When I turned 70, I got such a shock. I said to my son, how did I get here? And then when he turned 50, I felt absolutely compelled. If I said to anybody, oh, my son, we're going up to his 50th birthday. And then I added, I had him when I was very young. And I couldn't restrain myself. It's a bit like when I go to the doctors. With almost every doctor I've ever been to, I try not to say it, but within 5 minutes I've said, oh, my son's a doctor, he's an emergency room doctor. So that's going to give me some greater degree of care, and I think I'm just such a Jewish mother from one end of me to the other. My son, the doctor. I mean, really.
And also, you are in New York. I feel like it's a totally appropriate thing to say to a doctor in New York. My son, the doctor. It's like, it's a perfect thing to say.
Yeah, I wonder if it's just the city. No, I think it's just me.
Okay.
Well, puts them on guard because I have somebody else.
Yes, exactly. Be careful with me.
Exactly.
There are a lot of really great essays in this book, and many of them touch on. It's a very funny book. I think it's Lexington Avenue, where you talk about the connotations of the word senior. That in other categories, senior is this, a senior advisor, a senior executive, and suddenly a senior as a person of age is less than. It's very funny, but also, in the midst of that, there are these fantastically powerful essays on Trump and COVID and the election day in November last year. But I particularly want to ask you what it felt like for you, having, lived in America for many decades, as you've described already this evening, having grown up with the parents and the people that you grew up with who survived the war, with everything that entailed for them, what it felt like to hear Trump's rhetoric, to live through that.
It felt it felt overwhelming because it felt like another era. And I never ever thought we would live through anything like that, through propaganda, through lies. It's what every major dictator in history has done, is you just say something that's a lie and then you repeat that lie and you keep repeating that lie and it works. You know, you say that your children can't go to kindergarten because the Jews are taking up all the kindergarten places, or you can't study medicine because it's full of Jews. And soon enough, very ordinary people who normally wouldn't hate, it brings out the hatred in them. And they believe it, and they believe it no matter how extreme it gets. You know, they believe that Jews carry diseases and you can't walk near them. And so nobody says anything about the restrictions that come out every day on Jews or in other countries. You know, always on Jews, but it includes other people as well. So I found that very, very disconcerting. And to have people blatantly lying and saying things that are detrimental to millions of people. You know, when Trump left office, about 2 months after he left office, I said to David, there's something quiet, you know, things seem quieter. And I was just talking about my own life, you know, there's a peacefulness. And then I realised it was Trump. He wasn't there anymore. You know, and I found it dangerous. The thing that frightened me most was how many people let out their anger and their racist attitudes and their hatred. That's the thing I found. I used to think that it was just as easy to bring out the best in people as it was to bring out the worst. I think it's much easier to bring out the worst. And I knew that from I have hundreds, if not well over 1,000 books, Holocaust books. And I knew that ordinary people, it required an awful lot of ordinary people to do what happened, you know, to kill millions of people. This is some organisation, you know. And I never thought I would see such hatred again. I mean, I lived through the late 1960s as a rock journalist, and I went to the Monterey Pop Festival, and it was love, peace and brotherhood, basically. Everybody sharing food, sharing drugs, you know, but there was such warmth between everybody. And I thought, I knew the world could change overnight, you know, spin on its axis and be another world. And I thought, this is it. This is it. And this is a good, you know, change in the world. And I was so excited until it all fizzled out. You know, so I've lived through the growth of the women's movement in America, and that just seemed to hold such promise. And then that fractured in many ways. I mean, of course, they did brilliant work, and some of it has changed the way we live. But it looked as though it was going to be a huge force to reckon with. And that didn't exactly happen straight away. They made a huge difference, especially some of the leaders. I mean, I so didn't like Gloria Steinem, you know, and there were, you know, there are Australians who did it as well. So I knew the world could change, and I thought this was a change for the good. Then when Trump came into office, I could see the world changing. Mm-hmm. I found it was frightening. I've never, ever wanted to kill anybody. You know, you just hear people say lightheartedly, I'd like to kill him. But at one stage I thought, why have the good presidents been assassinated, or somebody's tried to assassinate them, and here nobody's tried it with Trump. Why has one person tried it? And I feel terrible when I wish somebody that degree of ill, but he was destroying so many people's lives with his lies about the vaccine. He swallowed detergent.
I read a wonderful, I think it was a piece in the New Yorker about the evolution of American, not just American politics, but American history, that there are these steps forward and steps back. And it happens in every corner of the world, but often in these very marked, in these very extreme ways. You see it in the United States after the Civil War and the period of Reconstruction, where there were more African Americans in Congress than ever before, and then the backlash against that ends with something like, that begins with something like the Tulsa Massacre in the 1920s, which started with the lynching of a young Jewish man as well. But you see that if Barack Obama came into power in the United States, that Trump is some terrible kind of response to that.
Oh yes,
yeah, and I think there's something. And when you spoke before about the way that that people in Poland, you write about it in Too Many Men, that people in Poland were taught that Jewish people were like a virus, and it reminds me of all the anti-Asian hate we're hearing now. Of the Asian people protesting, especially in America, saying we are not a virus, and it's come here as well because of everything, that the hate and xenophobia that's been stirred up by COVID. I'm conscious of the time, and I want to say to people, if you've got questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can from about 8:45 onward. I think I'm going to go a little bit more with Lily. I was going to say, just moving from the horrors of Trump, that one of the other beautiful things about these essays is how funny they are. It's a real hallmark of your writing, this very it's not black and it's not bleak, very droll, very deadpan, but it's infused into everything. I was rereading Too Many Men, and the exchanges between Rudolf Höss and Ruth are hilarious. And you can't imagine that you're laughing with somebody who was the commandant of Auschwitz, but your control of that is brilliant. One of my favorite essays in the new collection is called Funerals, which is, for people who haven't read it yet, is about this idea that you could actually be at your own funeral and say a few words at your own funeral, which I thought was just hilarious. But I wanted
to, a very good idea.
It's a brilliant idea. I wanted to ask you about your use of humor, if I could. That I guess, how conscious are you of using humor in your work, and also this idea of how Jews use humor? There was I was lucky enough recently to hear Edgar Keret, and he spoke about the idea that he says humor is Jewish humor is the weapon of the weak. He said that weakness came from not having a country, from not having an army. Humor was the Jewish way of maintaining self-respect among people who disrespected you. And I wondered if you could reflect on that a bit.
Well, for me personally, humour is like just part of who I am. I am. My brain just comes out with something funny, and I like to make people laugh. I don't do it consciously, but when I was a kid, my aim was to make my mother laugh, and it was very hard. But I don't do anything consciously when I write, other than try to be as clear as I can and be as honest as I can. And I think in Too Many Men, I think the humour in it is a relief for me. It's just a relief. I almost used to laugh in my conversations with Rudolf Höss and the way I worked out how to hurt him.
It's brilliant.
And how much I knew about him. I just loved it. I knew I wanted to write Höss's biography through the novel, but I had no idea how to do it. And I was sitting on a bus one day in Manhattan, and I thought, this is how I'm going to do it, because I'd been writing the book and I knew I had to work out how to put Höss in it one way or another. It was funny, when I finished the book, I was walking along West Broadway and I thought, I really miss Höss. Like when you've been living with somebody and you really know an awful lot about them, it's a really weird thing to suddenly come to an end. And I think humour is essential. I've often said that for myself, my sense of humour has saved me.
And it sounds like as well, when you talk about your father and the wonderful Max, that it saved him too. And I feel like we can't have an hour together or a bit less than an hour together without talking about Max. And I know that he lived until he was 101. It's an extraordinary life. And he really lived, from the things you write about. He loved life, and I love reading about him and hearing his voice. And I wondered if you have thoughts now and throughout his life about what made him like that, so willing to be able to kind of access and enjoy life and joy.
I don't know what made him like that. I think he was probably a very upbeat, mischievous young man. I mean, his father owned many companies and he worked for them, but not very hard. He was a playboy, and I think his attitude was, when he told me stories about Auschwitz, there were stories against himself and he would laugh afterwards, and I knew it wasn't funny. But my dad loved to laugh, and it was one of the great pleasures of my life to make him laugh. If I did something stupid, he would just almost die laughing, put the house keys in the fridge. He couldn't believe it. And then I wanted to call his local car service to take me over to my father's. I could have walked, it was a 15-minute walk. But I asked them, I lived in Soho at the time, and I just said, could they come to my address and pick me up? And it's called Delancey, and right next to Delancey was the dentist. And when I rang up, my dentist said to me, Lily, I would love to come and pick you up and take you over to the Lower East Side, but I can't, I'm in Queens. And I said, Dr. Bletchner, I'm so sorry. And my father listened to the story, started laughing and said, well, much better than ringing up the car service and asking them, can they fix your teeth? He was a divine man. I had him to 71 years of my life, and I've often thought, how many people have a father or a parent for 71 years of their life, a parent who's still full of life, still loves life. I was so lucky to have him.
I think one of the things that touch people so much is that you spoke frankly about the things that he'd lived through and how you learnt about them and how you kept the memory of some of those people that he lost, but also that you also celebrated that you two also really liked each other. And that's, parents and adult children can love each other and can want to be there for each other, but they don't always seem like such a great kind of fit. You two seem like such good kind of peas in a pod.
We just loved each other, but we each had a very similar sense of humour. And we appreciated each other's sense of humour. And my dad, he was very, very straight. For years and years, I cooked food for him, froze it, and walked over from Soho to the Lower East Side to give it to him. And when he wanted chopped meat, I chopped the meat. Then he decided he wanted ground meat, minced meat, so I made the minced meat. And I made a variety of dishes until one day he said, I don't like it anymore. He said, I don't like what you cook anymore. And I just thought to myself, okay, I've been carting these tons of frozen food. My daughter was buying him vegetables and new clothes and making sure he changed his socks every day. And suddenly he said, I don't like it. I said, oh, okay. And so then I bought him food from a Polish store nearby. He said, this is much better.
Thanks, Dad.
I thought all those years I spent.
Fantastic. But at least he was honest,
Oh, no, he was very honest. He said of my books, this one's not so good.
Oh, okay. It's wonderful. But maybe that's the foundation of part of that relationship, I think. I want to get to some of these lovely questions that are coming in. If we have time, I might come back at the end and ask you one more. There's a question here. Is Lily able to talk about too many men being made into a film, which I also read about? I understand that there's a film in the works with Mandy Patinkin. Is that right?
Yeah, it's starring Mandy Patinkin and Lena Dunham.
Wow.
And they've never worked together before. This has been a long time in the making. Movie making is very complicated, and like 9,000 people have a say in what should happen. Is so unlike writing. I mean, you're writing something, but it's so unlike writing. And at one stage, I just thought it's never ever going to happen. A lot of movies don't happen, but Mandy Patinkin is a fabulous human being, and so is Lena Dunham. And to me, they're human rights activists. They care about people. And I know they're big names, and so therefore the movie is going to draw a lot of people. But it's just really important to me that the quality of the characters, and I'm really happy. They've called it Iron Box. I'm not sure exactly why. I mean, I do know, but anyway, it's there. I was talking to the scriptwriter one day, and I said, look, Ruth wouldn't say this, and rewrote Ruth. And he said, no, Ruth would. And I said, no, it's totally, totally out of the realm of reality for her to speak like that. And he said, this is my Ruth, not your Ruth. And I got it.
What a great exchange to have, though. It's exactly, there are some writers who just wash their hands of it, and there's some writers who can't let go. But what a wonderful way to see how something that is how your work is going to be is going to have another life. Yeah,
and I realise it's absolutely true. You sell the rights to it, and they were really good in letting me work on it with them and wanting me to be involved. But above all, when he said, this is not your Ruth, I thought, you're right. So this is my Ruth. And I thought, yeah, this is your Ruth.
There's a lovely, both a comment and a question from Catherine, who says that she and her mother have also really love your work. Your writing is pure, beautiful, and simple, and it's accessible to students that she teaches as well. And she asked, to what extent do you think Yiddish or Polish, or being multilingual, might have influenced the way you write?
What influenced the way I write was the fact that my parents and almost everyone around us couldn't speak English. And so I was one of the first to be able to speak English. And I had to speak very slowly. Americans think I'm asleep when I speak, because Americans speak quite speedily when I answer the phone, to perfect strangers. Somebody's receptionist said, oh, have I woken you up? So I learned to speak very slowly and very carefully and choose my words so that nothing would be too complicated. And I think that's what really influenced me, having to think about exactly the right word that people would understand and not use any colloquialisms. I don't know anyway. I mean, David asked me, did I ever say something really weird? Did I ever say Dunny? And I said, no, I haven't said Dunny ever in my life. I mean, he's got all these Australianisms which he insists on keeping, whereas I've tried to adapt to American English. But I think really it was having to speak very, very clearly. And I don't like writing that you have to read 10 times before you understand the sentence. It may be very clever. It's just not it's not what I want to read. I want to read clarity.
Yep. Someone's asked, and I'm glad they did, very quickly, what are the stacked boxes behind you, if you don't mind telling us? There's amazing metal ones. No, they're the metal drawers. What's inside them?
They're from a high school, and they're former gin lockers.
Very
It's
cool.
ridiculous.
Do you keep things inside them, or are they just for show? Okay.
No, there's nothing just for show.
No, I didn't think so. Just
My
checking.
house. No, I keep at least half of them are full of pens and pencils. I mean, I need to live to be 450.
I think we need you. We need you to live to be 450. So that's going to work out for everybody, I think.
He's got a lot of stationery in it, and other stuff. I just love them.
Someone else has asked, do you write every day? And also, which writers do you love?
No, I don't write every day. When I'm in the middle of a novel, I do write every day. Maybe not 7 days a week, but which writers do I love? I love Raymond Carver. I love a lot of poets. Marina Sveteva, Dalia Ravakovich, Israeli poet. There are so many of them that I love. And I think poetry soothes me. I read a lot of nonfiction, and the books I tend to read, the novels I tend to read, are about African American history, about homelessness. You know, somebody said to me, and I've got this huge shelves of Holocaust books, I've just got way too many, and I swear I won't buy any more, and then I buy more and more and more and more. And they said to me, do you read anything cheerful? And I thought, I do. But I do read. I mean, I don't know anyone except for academics who's read the Nuremberg trials of Nazi doctors. Mm. It's not just the Nuremberg trials, it's a separate trial, and it details all the medical experiments. And it's a very, very tough book to read. Mm. And I don't know why I feel compelled to know all of this. And then I found myself into the book I'm currently writing, which I've had a lot of trouble writing because the pandemic has just filled my head. But I realised I'm using parts of the research that I read in those trials. So even I read a book years and years ago, and I was reading it again. It's called Welfare Brat, and it's about being brought up on welfare. It's just weird to have my sort of selection of books that I love, but it's the poems that I go back to. Anna Kamienska, I like Pablo Neruda and Sexton. Mm-hmm. The worrying aspect of the poets I love is, with the exception of Pablo Neruda, everyone else committed suicide. Mm. That's worrying. I don't know why. I mean, they were great, great poets.
Mm. Someone asked, it's a lovely question, is your father your ideal reader? You said before that he was very frank with you.
Well, that's ideal. I like people to tell me what they don't like. It's not really pleasant to hear. Mm. But if I agree with them, then I'm pleased that they said it, And I think my father wasn't ideal because he was a bit haphazard in what he liked and what he didn't like. And I could never have predicted, I try not to write anything that would identify my children. But today it's very easy to identify and find where anyone is anywhere. But my dad, at first he thought reading Holocaust books would kill me. And I said, many things can kill you, but not books. He said, if you read those books, they'll kill you. But then he was very, very proud of me. I mean, I don't have an ideal reader. I just want somebody who enjoys reading the book and maybe learn something they didn't know. It's not that I think I'm, the Dalai Lama who's got a lot of advice for everybody, because I'm definitely not. I'm way too anxious to be the Dalai Lama anyway.
Maybe we need an anxious Dalai Lama, just an idea. There's another beautiful question here about the illustrations. I'm really glad someone raised it. And it's that most of the illustrations are painted by David, who's your husband. When David paints lovely illustrations they ask for your books, do you work together on the ideas for the drawings, or does he interpret your writing to decide what to draw?
He decides everything about his art. I don't. I don't.
Yeah.
If he reads my book, I give him each chapter of everything I've written to read. He often says small things, but helpful things. No, I couldn't possibly. I know the finished result, and I know which two paintings I'd like, but he's been painting me forever, and I never sit for him. So he's pretty good. If I ask him to slim my hips down a bit, he will.
Very good. We're almost out of time. I want to ask sort of one or two more questions and then a quick one of my own, and then I'll hand back over to Nick. Someone asked, Larry asked, whether you'd actually ever read Mein Kampf, and if so, what you learnt from it. Have you ever read it?
Read it.
Yeah, you haven't read it? No, fair enough.
I don't want to read it.
A lovely question. What do you do for relaxation?
I walk and I don't dance, I don't ski.
Walking is good.
I do. I walk and I see my children. I find that so nourishes me to see my children and my grandchildren, because I have a lot of them. We're a much bigger family than we were when we arrived in Australia. We have 8 grandchildren. My son has 4, and my father said to me that my son was single-handedly trying to repopulate the Ashkenazi Jews of Europe.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you quickly before we finish that, there's been a lot of writing about the expectations on the children of Holocaust survivors. People refer to them, I think, as memorial candles sometimes. And I wanted to close by asking you what your wish is for what your writing does out in the world. When you send it out into the world, whether you felt a kind of moral responsibility to write or to bear witness, but what is it that you hope your writing does when it hits us, lands with us?
Well, what I hope it does is several things. I hope it makes people laugh and makes people cry. And above all, shows them some of the catastrophic consequences of hatred. And the one thing that I pointed out many, many times to people is it wasn't monsters that created any of the genocide, certainly the genocide of Jews, because it required hundreds and thousands of people to keep all that machinery going, ordinary people. And I want them to know that we're all capable of this. And people get shocked when I say, I'm capable of this when I'm talking, and you're capable of this. And because people like to make it abstract, and they think it's monsters who did everything else. But they weren't monsters. They were, Nazis, Nazis in the upper echelon of the Nazi Party, who happened to be stationed at Auschwitz, wrote home to their parents, darling Helga, I miss you so much. How are the children? How they're doing at school? And today we had roast pork and apples for dinner with a nice glass of so-and-so. And the same guy has that day been either gouging out Jewish people's eyes while they're alive for experiments on eyeballs, or doing appalling things, and yet he sounds like a great father. There's one after the other, different letters from different. And so for me, if they just learn something about we're all the same, it doesn't matter if we don't look the same, if we don't speak the same language, and that they have some understanding that even if they're just kind of, you never know how your books affect people. I didn't think about any messages, anything when I was writing, and I try not to now, because I think if you think, I've got to get this message across, it's not a novel anymore. And so I don't really think about what I'd like people to get out of it. I'd like them to keep reading the book if possible. And probably nothing more than that, other than seeing those things I mentioned, that we're all capable of it.
Well, I think, sorry.
They can't just think this wouldn't be me, because it would be me and it would be you.
I think there's
no twin, and it would be you.
But I think there are so many gifts in your writing about the extraordinary kind of the glue of love, the way that love can heal, or the way that humor can heal and repair, even in small moments. You write about that beautifully. We didn't get to talk about New York, but that you say joy is made up of small moments. And there are so many of those moments in New York, and there are so many moments that you've given us in your writing, in your poetry, in your novels, in your essays, in your columns, works that have been adapted for the stage that we might even get to see adapted for the screen. I'm going to hand back over to Nicholas, but I want to say, over 300 people here tonight. Thank you so much for your extraordinary body of work, and we can't wait to read what comes next. Thank you, Lily Brett.
Thank you. I was hanging on every single word tonight. It was just glorious. Thank you, Lily and Michaela, so much. The conversation was it was a delight. It was nourishing on so many levels. Lily, you and your writing are adored by so many, and your mere presence tonight has managed to overcome Zoom fatigue among so many. And I think everyone's going to pick up one of your old books or your new book, if not tonight, then tomorrow or the next day. Michaela, thank you so much for your insightful and thoughtful interview, both the content and the style. It was an absolute, tonight was just wonderful. Thank you so much. We have 2 more events planned for this year, everyone. One with Jewish Quarterly, as we've done a couple already, and the other, our very popular summer reading guide. Please subscribe to our newsletter via our website, or follow our socials to find out the dates and the details of those. And most excitedly, we've started planning for a live festival for next year, fingers crossed. So even more reason to keep informed on what's happening and what's going on. Again, just many thanks again to Lily and Michaela. Lily, you've got permission to go back to bed now. I'll just it was 6 o'clock in the morning when this started in New York, everybody. So we so appreciate it, and look, we could have just done. We should do a series of these, starting in Caulfield, or starting in Carlton, and then to Caulfield, and then here and then there, and it was wonderful. Thank you so much, and thank you all of you who joined us tonight. There were so many of you, really. You can now also go to bed, Lily to catch up on sleep, and the rest of us to get some sleep. I hope you all enjoyed this evening as much as I did. Many thanks to everybody. See you soon, and good night.
Farewell. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good night.